Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.
Okay, Don, let's start with a pretty basic question. What do we mean when we use the term social activism, especially when it's used in the context of business corporations and their senior officers?
We should probably start by understanding that business corporations and their senior officers have been engaged in various kinds of political lobbying and engagement for a long, long time. What seems to be new and what's being called social activism is not as clearly connected to bottom line results as the usual kinds of political engagement, resisting costly regulations, lobbying for favors, subsidies, getting approval for mergers, and that sort of thing. So the more traditional political engagement is pretty uncontroversial because all the stakeholders of the corporation figure that by getting special favors from government, getting approval for mergers, resisting costly regulations will have a favorable impact on the bottom line over time. Social activism, by contrast, is much less connected to perceived bottom line results and may not even be motivated by bottom line results.
So is it more likely to be motivated by thoughts of altruism or charity or social good rather than the conventional economic motivations?
We have a lot of examples to turn that good question over and over. We have a lot of CEOs that get engaged in social issues like gender equality, race relations.
Well, that makes good sense.
Rights, healthcare, lots of different issues that may be in the wheelhouse of the company's mission, values, and its employees. Part of it, as I think we'll see, is about catering to the employees and a certain set of investors in the company that share the values of the company. As I'll try to explain a little later, it's also about not being able to stay on the sidelines when you think your core values as a company are threatened.
Don, in our previous exchange, you mentioned a couple of the themes that some of the social activism seem to be taking recently. Could you cite some recent examples that our listeners may be familiar with of well-known corporate CEOs who have been engaging in social activism and what causes they were being socially active about?
Yes, Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, has commented on immigration. There's an alignment with visas and being able to get people of great talent in from all over the world to work on Facebook. So it's a social issue as well as a political issue. It happens to align with the company's objectives. Sheryl Sandberg, also of Facebook, COO, has talked a lot and written a book about gender equality. Howard Schultz, Racing Together, not a campaign that went over particularly well, but wanted his baristas to talk about race relations as they gave out cups of mocha latte and the like. So I'm not sure how long that campaign lasted, but again, there's a CEO pressing the company and the public on some social issues. Lloyd Blankfein, surprisingly, not commonly associated with same-sex marriage, actually came out publicly in favor of same-sex marriage. The most recent kinds of things that have gotten people talking a lot about quote-unquote social activism among CEOs are Tim Cook of Apple and Mark Benioff of Salesforce, also a San Francisco West Coast operation. And they came to blows verbally with governors of Georgia, Indiana, and especially North Carolina over religious liberty bills that allowed businesses to discriminate against LGBT folks if their religions so disposed them. So that's a most recent example of social activism. There were some boycotts threatened. Some people politically in Georgia and Indiana and North Carolina thought these CEOs were interfering in the democratic process. A very interesting charge being made by politicians who thought that CEOs should stay out of politics altogether.
Well, we've certainly changed that attitude recently, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
Don, is this social activism on the part of CEOs, is this a relatively new trend? And if so, what conditions, what kind of environmental conditions seem to be driving or at least enabling this activity?
Right, great question, Dan. I think really this goes back to the 1970s. At the time, there was a better sense of separation between the public governance and private enterprise. And since the 1970s, and when business, I think, felt blindsided by all the regulations and all the government, the heavy hand of government, if you will, that Reagan famously campaigned on. So it was Lewis Powell, the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, that now famously wrote a letter to the education head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and said, business needs to fight back. There's too much sense in academia and among young people that capitalism is a bad thing and we are moving too fast towards socialism and communism. And he really sounded the alarm, and business paid attention, and the Chamber of Commerce has paid attention. So the rise in political lobbying by private enterprise really began in earnest as a reaction to all the regulations, Clean Air, Clean Water, Occupational Safety Health Act, the sense that government was in charge of the private sector. So the pushback began then and has continued since, to a point where companies feel very free in being very politically active in Congress, at the state level, in administrative agencies, in all kinds of ways, to shape the legal regulatory environment in ways that they like, that are good for their companies. So the Supreme Court has even recognized the right of a corporation to speak out on public issues in the Citizens United decision. So there's no question that companies have a right to do this. The question is, when is it the right thing to speak out? And on what issues. Business leaders like Benioff and Cook have actually said, in particular Mark Benioff, CEOs have to stand for something. It's kind of interesting to note in the current week that we're in, here in early December 2016, the new cabinet seems to be stocked with business leaders who are going to lead government. So the overlap between government and private enterprise has become more and more, and it has increased over the years. So it's not unusual to think now that business leaders are going to have a say directly and indirectly in public policy and governance. Now, some motivations. There are some companies, notably on the West Coast, Benioff's and Cook's, that have mission and value statements that are very much in favor of inclusiveness and diversity. So, for example, Apple's website tells us that we see diversity as something that makes an employee who they are. We foster a diverse culture that is inclusive of disability, religious belief, sexual orientation, and service to country. We want all employees to be comfortable bringing their entire selves to work every day. I'll stop there. It does go on, but entire self, meaning we don't want our employees to have to hide who they are. If they're gay, they're gay. If they're transvestite, they're transvestite. Now again, this comes from a culture of the West Coast, which is not the same as Nebraska or North Dakota. Clearly we have differences in culture throughout this fairly diverse and now polarized country. So there's a lot going on there. I think Benioff and Cook are speaking to their employees as well as their customers. And I'll just note real quickly, there has been a study, Chatterjee and Toffel, now in the Harvard Business School working papers, that did a survey. And in this survey, they did a robust number of interviews and found that as far as Apple's customers were concerned, it was a good thing that Tim Cook came out swinging against the governor of Indiana, now our vice president-elect, Mike Pence, in the Indiana religious liberty law. Most people, they found, had a favorable view of what Cook was doing. And the ones who didn't have a favorable view were still likely to buy Apple products. A lot of that has to do with Apple's position in the market and what the economists call inelasticity of demand. If you want an Apple product, you're going to buy an Apple product, regardless of what Tim Cook has to say.
So it sounds like this issue of kind of corporate social activism is a result of a whole, like many things, a whole variety of forces, cultural, social, economic, political, legal, and creates this sort of new set of activities for corporations and senior executives.
Exactly right.
I would think, Don, that such social activism on the part of corporations and their senior officers is not universally approved of by others in the business field or possibly the legal fraternity or in the academic community. What are the common objections to this activity?
Right, there are many objections. Let's take the academic community first. Basic idea is that companies should stay neutral in matters political. That comes from Milton Friedman, Archie Carroll, and others. Milton Friedman, many of our listeners might remember, famously wrote that corporate social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. In that famous New York Times Magazine article, Friedman basically said that a corporation should comply with the law and ethical custom and otherwise pay attention to profits. Archie Carroll said much the same thing, noted stakeholder proponent, University of Georgia, talking about corporate social responsibility. One of the 4 key points that Carroll makes is a corporation should obey the law. Both of those thinkers at that time, we're talking early 70s, early 80s, conceived of a clear separation between the private sector on the one hand and public governance on the other. But companies often ignore the law or bend the law when it's profitable to do that. And companies have been on the front lines of lobbying for this law or against that law or modifying various proposed regulations for quite some time. We all know the phenomenon of regulatory capture, where the agency is essentially captured by those it is supposed to regulate. There's also a phenomenon known as the revolving door, where people come in and out of the private sector to the public sector and back again. Goldman Sachs is a very famous example. So it's entirely valid to suppose that private enterprise will engage politicians on a wide array of issues, and especially where it impacts the bottom line. So I think the academic perspective from the 1970s from Milton Friedman is a bit out of date given the current realities of revolving door, regulatory capture, and political engagement generally by corporations. From the business perspective, it's be careful. You can offend some key stakeholders. Those could be investors, consumers, politicians. For example, not everybody was happy when John Mackey came out against Obamacare. There are a lot of people that patronize Whole Foods that didn't like that particular political stance. Still, Whole Foods had enough clout in the market, enough presence in the market that Whole Foods did not suffer much from that kind of public speaking by John Mackey. So in their study, Chatterjee and Toffel warn us that you must calculate the risks and benefits fairly carefully if you're a company like Apple or Salesforce when you make public pronouncements or take public stands. The legal perspective is kind of murky. There are those on one side who say always maximize shareholder value. There are those on the other side, like Lynn Stout of Cornell, who say there's a myth about maximizing shareholder value that is not required by law. Managers, CEOs, C-suite people generally do not always have to pay attention to immediate short-term profits. So this is a debate that has gone on for years. I would say the legal perspective is mixed on this, and I go back to the business perspective, which says just be careful, manage your stakeholders well, make sure that what you're doing aligns with the company's mission, values, and the likely benefits of making a public stand on something like human rights, LGBT rights, gender equality, and other issues that come up.
You know, Don, it seems that the examples we've been talking about, these companies seem to be among the most successful companies, not only in terms of profitability, but more importantly in terms of their market position, their market share, and their customer loyalty, which of course translates into strong financial performance, which the shareholders would appreciate. It appears that a very successful corporate platform is a very good platform for a CEO who wants to make some socially activist pronouncements. They're a lot safer from these objections, right?
Market position really helps. Apple almost seems impregnable, and yet there have been movements in the stock price. Some shareholder activists would say, let's not go there. Mackey had the same experience with some of his shareholders, and when he was here at DU, he said, shareholders know where we stand, and they know that we give a certain percentage of our profits to philanthropy, and if they don't like it, they don't have to buy the stock. I think that's different from Mackey or any other CEO taking a stand that is at a certain time in the political discourse of the nation and coming up with something that strikes a discordant note with investors, shareholders, customers, and others. I do think you need to be careful about those pronouncements, but if you're a Mackey or if you're Tim Cook, market position is going to help you. It's notable that a lot of CEOs joined in Benioff and Cook's public pronouncements and statements against some of these religious liberty laws. A lot of companies, though, did stay on the sidelines. They remained politically neutral. So when a company chooses not to be on a matter of human rights or some kind of social issue, as opposed to one of those let's fend off this regulation or propose a law that helps ourselves, if you're looking at social issues generally and being activist, caution would probably be the best approach, and making sure that you have alignment with the board and with key stakeholders.
You know, Don, I have a pretty high level of respect for these men and women in noticeable roles of CEOs of outstanding companies who really believe personally in some cause or another that's in the political, social environment, and are willing to stand up and publicly make a very clear and passionate statement about their interest in this cause. You know, the fact that they're running very successful organizations is helpful, and they're, I think, willing to put that reputation in play. So it makes me feel good, and it makes me feel proud of them and their companies.
So I hear you saying that you are in favor of CEOs coming out and taking a strong stand where their values and the company's values align with a certain position that may be contrary to popular thinking or proposed legislation or even existing legislation on social issues, whether it's immigration, healthcare, gender equality, same-sex marriage, LGBT rights. Am I correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think I agree, and largely because the line between social and economic has become more and more blurred, and the line between private enterprise and public governance has become more and more blurred. And I tend to agree with Benioff that at this point, corporations are, and certainly public corporations, are some of the most important actors in our entire society. And so remaining politically neutral for reasons that I've set forth is really not a realistic view of what's going on. Corporations are deeply engaged not only in the economic life of this country, but also the social and cultural life of this country. Most people spend most of their time working in their jobs, and many of those are in publicly held companies. So if a corporation doesn't stand for something, to take Benioff's words, what is it doing? There is a great challenge in this country right now as to what our values are, what we believe in, and what we want going forward. I'm very impressed with the recent work by 3 authors at Harvard Business School. One of them is Lynn Payne, and she and 2 other colleagues at Harvard wrote a book called Capitalism at Risk. And if you wanted to distill the essence of that book, it's that corporations have too long been engaged in milking the system for what they can get for their companies and their shareholders without a view of the entire social, cultural fabric as well as the market system. They find that the kind of rent-seeking and lobbying that's been done is actually putting the entire market system at risk. And the title of the book, again, is Capitalism at Risk. I highly recommend it. People can talk about the market. People can say, oh, the market is a great thing. We have lots of buyers and sellers. And the economists would say, yes, you need that. You need information that's non-asymmetric. Buyers and sellers need to know pretty much the same thing. We need a reasonable supply of public goods. People and firms should not pollute the environment and impose costs on others. All that is a great ideal of the perfectly competitive economy. Basically, companies in their self-interest, following maximizing shareholder value, are going to pursue that to the nth degree, to where they would welcome subsidies, special treatment from government, exemptions from extant laws, all kinds of things that don't serve the greater interest. So when Benioff and Cook stand up for their employees, their values, their mission statement, and they take a political stand, it's refreshing that they're not just out there trying to get more money for their shareholders. So to that extent, I agree. Again, they must be careful to see that the values that they're espousing and the positions they're espousing line up with their board. This is good corporate governance process, that it's unlikely to offend key stakeholders, or if so, their market position is such that they can afford to do that. So selectively, I applaud those who would take social positions, and again, social and economic positions are in some ways much the same. If you deny opportunity to some, you are impacting them economically.
I remember clearly Tim Cook making the statement think it was on a quarterly conference call when he got a question about his social activism, and he said something like, well, we love our shareholders, but if they don't love us, they ought not to own our shares.
That sounds about right.
Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business. College of Business. College of Business.